Tolkien scholars, people that, well, anyway, people who are really nerds about Tolkien, I guess is what I'm saying, whether they're professionally so or otherwise, know that he didn't really contribute a lot to his professional, or at least he took criticism for not contributing a lot to he's an English professor, but he didn't really contribute much to the field. He taught, but he was considered sometimes a brilliant lecturer, but he mumbled terribly. People kind of really had to already be devotees to get much out of him. But earlier on in his career, and about this time in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote an essay on the Beowulf poem that really transformed the field, and that transformation is still present, because at the time Beowulf was basically being read as the only not overtly Christian heroic Germanic poem in Old English. And no one really cared much about the story, but they were trying to discern what they could about the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons and this and that, and effectively doing textual criticism without appreciating the story for what it was. Tolkien hated that, and he wrote The Monsters and the Critics to basically argue that, he begins with an allegory that for his criticism, and I want to read this aloud because this passage needs to be read at some point on this podcast. So he writes this, and he certainly had written this essay before he drafted this version of The Lord of the Rings. I'm 99% sure. So this is the allegory from his academic essay. He says, "A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers, that older heroic hall. Of the rest of the stone, he took some and built a tower. But his friends, coming, perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps of the tower, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot even the stones. They all said, 'This tower is most interesting.' But they also said, after pushing it over, 'What a muddle it is in.' And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, 'He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion.' But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea." So his point in the essay is basically one should accept the Beowulf poem as a piece of art, doing something on purpose in its own right, and not simply try to take it apart to find remnants of the older poetic or religious tradition of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. But that idea of building something for the sake of seeing farther, and especially of trying to look on the sea, is something that was consistently important to Tolkien and reflects something of his own purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings at all. It is, I think, a message planted here, and in the final draft, in the introduction, for anyone that's willing to see it, that there is a greater purpose to this story, that it's intended to allow us to see more than we can see from our everyday reality. And that idea, of course, connects even to the name of the podcast here. We're named for Amon Sûl, which is another watchtower from which one might look far to see more than might otherwise be visible. And it connects even to our oft-repeated belief that there's a virtue in Tolkien's works that helps to orient us to what is highest and noblest. I am fairly certain I came up with that recognition mostly on my own, but there's a book that I talked about a couple episodes ago, The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien by John Garth, who's a relative newcomer to Tolkien studies. But basically he traveled around England especially, but even Europe, taking photos of the kind of landscapes that were important to Tolkien. So there's a whole section on how important the sea was to Tolkien. and he spent a lot of time visiting the sea, reflecting on it, and so it's got this beautiful image of the sea, the breaking on the rocks, here. Um, but this is something that Tolkien himself actually had painted over here. This image of a cove in Cornwall, again with the waves breaking on the rocks. So why it's important to him, it connects, it certainly inspires his imagination. He talks about this with Legolas and the sea longing coming upon him. This shows up later in the books. You haven't got to that part yet, Zach, but the sea is Enya sings the songs about going across the sea. It's there as well. And this idea of these towers is a big deal to Tolkien, and this is John Garth's point about this, and he gives 2 pages here, because apparently at the time Tolkien was writing this, there was a nonsensical tower being built in Oxford, and it was like being discussed and argued about all over England. This pointless tower. So Tolkien uses that for his Monsters and the Critics thing. He uses it again here in The Lord of the Rings and retains it over many, many, many revisions. But I think it really does connect that desire to see the sea, to look out on something beautiful and glorious. Is it's important to him. And really, I think it's what he's doing in this book in general. He's writing something that draws you in, that is humorous, that is beautiful, that is tear-jerking, but there's a larger point to it, and it's worthwhile for us to ask, even in a silly set of dialogue like that, or in a otherwise pointless chapter. Perhaps pointless, like A Shortcut to Mushrooms. What are we? What else should we be looking for here? What is the sea that this tower is built for us to be able to look at?